Hi folks, here we are again, another Tuesday evening. I hope you're all well. Nice to see the chat going quite vibrantly before we get started. Not quite at 8 o'clock, so we'll put the pre-show on for a second. Of course, the dogs are here. Well, one dog is here. The other dog keeps running away. There's too much else going on. But anyway, doggies are here. And here is the studio. Leith there, teed up, ready to come in. So we'll bring him on in just a second and have a really interesting conversation tonight about the property market and what's happening and how long will the bust go on for and what are the implications and what's driving it. So a lot of interesting conversation. And of course, feel free to put your questions, comments, suggestions as we go. As always like to get those questions and feed them into the show as we go. Anyway, we've hit the 8 p.m. So let me start the show formally. I'll be back in just a moment. Good evening. Welcome to this live stream on the 28th of July, 2026. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on this evening. Thanks for taking time out of your Tuesday, as always. Lovely to see some familiar faces and also, I think, a couple of new names too. So excellent. Leith, of course, is teed up ready to come in. Just before I bring him in, let me remind you that we're not providing specific financial or property or even legal advice. This is a general conversation. We moderate the chat, but do feel free to put your questions, comments in as we go. If you've got specific questions for Leith or myself, if you use that Walk the World DFA, that'll get into my queue and I can then bring them in as we go. I've also enabled Super Chat, which means you can get your question to the top of the list or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. And we thank you for all of those who support us via Super Chat, Patreon or PayPal. It makes a huge difference. We don't do this for profit. We just because it's a really important conversation to be had at the moment. And frankly, with things as they are at the moment, I think these conversations are becoming ever more important, not least because some of the critical issues are not actually being discussed in the mainstream and should be being discussed. So that's what we try and do, bring a bit more perspective. And Leith will, of course, be doing that. Let me bring him straight in. Hi, Leith. Welcome back.
G'day, Martin. How's things? Hello, everyone.
It's pretty good here. It's been very hot for the last month. We've got straw rather than grass now. And everybody complaining about how hot it is and humid and et cetera, et cetera. We don't have quite the fires that they have down in the south of France, but we can still a bit of smokiness in the air from time to time because the smoke sort of whistles around the place. Very warm.
Oh, it's nice. Well, mate, I wouldn't mind a bit of that now. I obviously had a couple of weeks in Vietnam and a little bit of time in Singapore, so that was very hot, but back in cold Melbourne at the moment. So, yeah, it's depths of winter down here, and I'm looking forward to sunny, longer days.
Yeah, that's right. And talking about the winter has really come to Victoria with regard to the political environment, right? So they've just replaced Jacinta 3 months or so out before the election, which interesting timing. But it does, for me, I think, bring a very important point. We're going to talk property, but you can't look at property in isolation, right? The property market is a function of the supply and demand around property, but it's also a function of the broader economic, social, and political drivers. And in fact, if you want to understand property market, you've got to understand the broader canvas, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, Victoria has obviously had, 6 years really where we've had very little house price growth. That's actually falling at the moment, but versus the other capitals. And our economy's also lagged the other markets as well. So basically this slower house price growth in Victoria and actually falling real house prices, while it's great for affordability, it obviously hasn't been great for the state budget, which is super reliant on stamp duty. It's also hasn't been, I guess, good at least in a short to medium term, I guess, for the economy. But in a longer term sense, you'd think that lower property values, ultimately households carrying less debt, all that sort of thing is good. But Victoria's sort of going through that painful transition that you have when you go from having a very expensive housing market to a less expensive housing market. And that's kind of similar to what's been experienced in New Zealand, I guess, and also Canada, which have also had pretty big real house price declines, actually bigger than Victoria. So, look, it's certainly not a very healthy state of affairs down here. And I've got some charts which I'll go through later. But the economy down in Victoria is sick on a whole bunch of measures. massively over indebted, and the next government, whether it's Labor or Liberal, obviously I think there's going to be a change of government. And I really hope there is. Has got a massive, challenge on their hands. We're going to have big time austerity down here in Victoria, where the government's going to basically have to slash costs. They just have to do it. There's no choice about it. And as a result, in the short to medium term, that's going to lower growth even further because they're going to be taking public demand out of the economy. But it's necessary for the long-term stability of the state because the debt situation down here is starting to get out of control. And I'll run through that a bit later. So, yeah, interesting times ahead.
Yeah, Michelle Bullock in a speech today was talking about the problem with high inflation. She was talking about the uncertainty that's out there, but also the fact that probably we've got to see unemployment a little higher to bring the supply-demand balance back a little bit. Of course, productivity is ultra low, and therefore the expectation possibly of higher rates. If not the next decision, then maybe the decision after that. Westpac, of course, is saying maybe one, maybe two rate hikes through to the end of the year. So there are a bunch of questions. And I find it fascinating, of course, now the property spruikers out there are talking about, but this is a short-term adjustment, but it's nothing serious, right? And Chalmers has been pretty much saying the same. But I think you and I would both suggest that we are probably looking at a more strategic realignment of the property market because of all the various drivers that are actually all coming at the same time. It's a perfect storm. It's a storm that's probably been long overdue because, of course, the indebtedness, as you say, is very high. Prices to income are massively off the scale relative to long term. And to highlight again, if you look at New Zealand as a bit of an archetype, prices can fall, did fall, will fall, and perhaps we're going to see something similar in Australia. Now, that is not necessarily good news for many people who've always seen property prices rise, but economically and strategically, it probably makes sense for property prices to right size. And that's the point. There's no such thing as sustainable property price growth from this point, right? It's impossible.
Yeah, absolutely. So Paul Keating obviously said in the early 90s it's the recession we have to have. Well, this is the house price correction we have to have because obviously home values have just had reached just such absurd levels, whether no matter which way you measure it. Late last year, totality at the end of, which used to be called CoreLogic, at the end of 2025, their housing affordability indicators were the worst on record relative to incomes, relative to, once you factor in mortgage payments, number of years to save a deposit, all these sorts of metrics that they measure, housing affordability in Australia was basically at its worst level on record, if not, equal worst. So that is ultimately unsustainable. And we would have had a price downturn anyway because of the rate rises and that sort of thing. And we already were entering a downturn before the federal budget. But now, obviously, the government's implemented these capital gains tax and negative gearing changes, which are just going to add so much more momentum to the downside now. And I think that's why, instead of having just a typical Australian house price correction where, values probably would have fallen, close to, I don't know, 6, 7, 8% or something like that, like the last couple of corrections we've had. This one's looking a lot more likely to be the biggest in 40 years and, probably very likely be double digit. Whatever that ends up being, who knows? But you can compare that to New Zealand, where in New Zealand, I'll just get this ready queued up before I've actually got some nice charts on New Zealand, which is probably worth segueing straight into because given that we're talking about it.
Okay.
But So the latest data on New Zealand is actually pretty stark. So these charts from Justin Farber, Antipodean Macro, they're as of June. They show that in nominal terms, you can see the housing correction across the major New Zealand markets on the left and also nationally. It's pretty steep. So nationally, values in New Zealand have fallen by just under 20% before inflation, that is. But on the right-hand side, you can see that once you adjust for inflation, home values in New Zealand are now back to where they were in March 2018. So it's a hell of a housing correction. And of course, New Zealand had one of the biggest house price booms during the pandemic. You can see that massive shoot up, but it's almost like a perfectly shaped bell curve that we've got there. Prices shot up and they've almost fallen in a mirror image on the downside. Now, I've spoken to a few Kiwis and I've had a few comments on my YouTube channel, etc. because I made the point in another podcast with Catherine Cashmore last week. I said that, for Australians who don't think that Australia could experience a similar correction to New Zealand or Canada. Now, I'm not saying we will, but you got to at least open up the possibility of it. There was very few Kiwis back in late 2021 when they started their correction who would have thought that values could fall by almost 20% nationally in nominal terms, and for real values to be back to where they were in 2018. There was very few Kiwis who would have thought that at the time, because Kiwis, like Australians, were used to home values forever rising. And now the expectation in New Zealand, it's changed from fear of missing out to fear of overpaying. And it's been a psychological shift. So they've gone from having decades of house prices rising with small dips in between, but the expectation is that they always go up over time, to now that belief has been shattered. And once that belief is shattered, you're less likely to get strong house price growth in the future. I'm not saying you mightn't get it in, say, 10 years' time or something, but for the foreseeable future, you're unlikely to get a strong rebound, because the belief that house prices always rise and the confidence that you can buy now and prices will be higher in 3 or 5 years' time is gone. Because people know, because they've just experienced a huge housing correction that almost nobody in New Zealand thought was possible. Now, what happens if, and Canada's, I don't have a chart on Canada. I wish I should have thought about that and got that before this podcast, but Canada's house price correction looks almost the same as the New Zealand one on the right. They're almost identical. They started correcting at almost the same time. Canada was a little bit later. New Zealand was late 2021. Canada was in 2022. But they've both been similar house price corrections. And Canada had experienced similar decades-long house price growth as Australia and New Zealand. And now Canadians are now experiencing huge house price correction, bordering on a crash. And that wouldn't have been on the radar of Canadians 3 or 4 years ago. They would have thought that's not possible. But now both Canada and New Zealanders have experienced it, and now they no longer believe that prices always go up. And once that belief's shattered, you're more likely to get a prolonged period, could be a decade, could be more, where home prices, at least when you adjust for inflation, basically just track sideways. And the question is Australia going to be in that same situation? Now, we don't know, but I think the risk is higher than it's been in my lifetime, basically. That we're going to get that scenario, and we're going to have a similar kind of correction. May not be quite as big, but a similar type of prolonged house price correction where values fall initially and then maybe don't go anywhere for years. And this, I don't think it's going to be a short, sharp rebound like the prior corrections we had, where you just end up going to a higher, your next peak is higher than your last peak. I think that's over.
Well, I am old enough to have lived through 4 property price corrections, 3 of which were in the UK. And the average...
the 90s one was bad.
Yeah. In some cases, it was actually government intervention. So, for example, they removed what was called mortgage interest relief at source. So suddenly government subsidies for mortgage payments were taken away. That had a 3.5-year wobble. And the more recent one in the UK also was nearly 5 years. So I guess it's one of the reasons why I've always been a bit twitchy about this idea that property prices can only ever go one way, up and up and up and up and up. And of course, people will say that's because of high migration, that's because of high inflation, that's because the government always throws more money on the fire to keep prices going up. But there is gravity. And the point now is, I think the gravity meter is just being turned up a little bit more firmly. And if you just sort of think about higher interest rates for longer, bond yields, of course, are continuing to go higher. The migration is still quite strong, but not quite as strong as it was. The supply is, it's not really meeting what is required in many areas. But even in Victoria, where, of course, they have built more recently, prices in Victoria actually, particularly around Melbourne, have actually gone and languished quite a lot. And then, of course, the kicker that you just highlighted with the New Zealand, inflation-adjusted prices are very different from the headline price, right? And because we've had very strong inflation in recent years, the real value of property is now a lot different from what people perhaps think it is. In fact, there's a poll that I've put in the show tonight. I've asked people whether they think this is going to be a sort of up to 6-month issue, 6 to 12 months or over 12 months. Towards the end of the show, I'll have a look and see what people are thinking, because I believe that this is actually going to be well over the year. And it could be 2, 3, 4 years possibly before we actually see. And then even then, again, could go sideways for a long, long time.
I think that's very, very likely. We're likely to have a multi-year correction, and then like one thing that might give a little bit of a pick up to it is if the government panics and in 18 months' time, I know people often in macro business they joke because 18 months because they used to say oh about 12 to 18 months, whatever, but 18 months from now we're going to be about 6 months before the next federal election.
Yes,
and there is a chance that the government will try and bring out some new sort of stimulus. And in fact, what they would have been smarter doing politically is to have not bought in the 5% deposit scheme last October, which was, let's be honest, has just set up first home buyers to get slaughtered. Let's be honest. You sucker in tens of thousands of first home buyers on 5% deposits at a time when they think interest rates have peaked, prices are going to keep rising, blah, blah, blah. And then you get smashed with 3 interest rate hikes. And then the government changes the tax rules to basically take investor demand out of the market. So you suck people in and then you pull the rug out and let values collapse on top of them. It wasn't very smart politically and not actually a very good thing to do. But what they should have done is instead of doing the 5% deposit scheme last year, they should have done the negative gearing capital gains tax changes a year ago when the market was still hot. And then they could have decelerated the housing market and you would have had the little spurt like that we got last year, the 3 or 4 months surge upwards from the 5% deposit scheme. And then before the next election, when people are grumpy about the prices falling, whatever, they go, all right, first home buyers, we've lowered the house prices for you. And now is the time to buy with the 5% deposit scheme and whatever. Get in there while it's cheap. I think that would have been smarter. But they did it the other way around. But there's nothing to stop the government from, in 18 months' time before the next election, suddenly bringing out some new scheme, to try and bolster house prices. But will it work? I mean, if the belief goes that prices aren't going to rebound like they used to, we're not going to get the massive run up again, and we start to get a bit more of a New Zealand type perception, well, maybe we won't get a big rebound next time. We'll just get a bit like what happened in Melbourne. Like we got a bit of a rebound in Melbourne after the 5% deposit scheme, and now it petered out very quickly. You'll just get like a little lame bounce and then a sideways or slightly negative market, a bit like what's happening in New Zealand at the moment. Most of New Zealand's house price decline actually happened in the first year or two, and for the last year or so, I think it's like nominally prices were down by about 1% over the year, so not a lot, but it's just basically doing nothing. It's going down very, very slowly. But once you adjust for inflation, it ends up being steeper. So they're kind of getting cheaper now, just through inflation and wages catching up with house prices. And I wouldn't be surprised if Australia has that sort of market over the next decade, where a bit like the Melbourne market that I've just experienced in the last 6 or 7 years, where now the price to income ratio in Melbourne's fallen heaps because we've had smallish house price falls, but more importantly, prolonged period of wages and inflation running way hotter than house prices. So yeah, it'll be interesting to watch what happens. But yeah, never discount the politicians, trying to work in self-interest. And I think if they were to do it, maybe in 18 months' time, just 6 months out for the next election, they'll try and, or it might even be more than 18 months, 4 months out from the next election, whatever it is. They might just try and do some sort of first home buyer, bribe or something like that to try and bolster the market. And in fact, we've seen Canada, the Canadian government in the last couple of weeks has actually brought out a sort of stimulus package for their building sector. So the Canadian government, to try and bolster the market and also support house prices, is now buying up stock from developers. So developers who are having trouble selling their stock in the market because prices are tanking and people don't want to buy, the government's now stepping in, buying up those homes to try and, as a stimulus package, as a support to the home building industry, but also as a way, I guess, to boost public housing a bit, which in that respect is not so bad, but it's more as a stimulus measure.
Yeah, and just on that, I've had the belief for some time that the government is under huge pressure from the building and construction industry to throw more money in their direction. If you look at the profitability of the building and construction sector, it's pretty shot at the moment. We've still got builders falling over left, right, and centre. So they've got an issue. The banks, of course, are twitchy as well because suddenly the credit boom that was there is beginning to dissipate. And so growth in credit, aka mortgage lending, has been the foundation of their profitability for years and years and years. That may change now. So the banks are going to be very twitchy. And of course, there's pressure from the banks to reduce the buffer. And of course, Chalmers came out recently and gave APRA and ASIC a bit of a kick to say, we want growth, please. We want growth, right? So your mandate should be growth related rather than just control related, which suggests to me that the pressure to reduce the lending buffer is probably going to get stronger. So you can see all of these forces, but I do believe that we're likely to see government intervention at some point, as you say, towards the election, simply because we know that when people feel less wealthy, then that's a problem from an election point of view. Although, interestingly, the recent poll showed that 61% of people believe that actually falling prices was probably good.
Yeah. That's also. I always take those polls with a grain of salt.
Somebody else.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, look, that's obviously good to hear, right? You don't want a society where everyone just wants housing to get more expensive, right? Because that's just going to end up robbing the next generation, robs your kids, all that sort of thing. It's not a good way to be. But it's a little bit like everyone wants action on climate change, but then when they're surveyed about how much they're willing to pay for it, it's almost nothing, right? So it's easy to sort of pretend you care, but when the rubber hits the road and you got to pay, then people tend to get annoyed. So I always take those surveys with a grain of salt. It's like, oh yeah, I'll be happy for house price to fall, but then when they start falling, they fall too much. Well, then people start getting annoyed, right? Especially if you're carrying a mortgage and you still got to pay the same mortgage. So yeah, I always take that stuff with a grain of salt. But anyway, like the bigger thing here is prices are obviously falling. The correction's broadening, but the bigger thing is actual volume turnover is the bigger problem, right? So we've had a massive decline in turnover, and one of the good indicators for this, who I watch, apart from just looking at the data, is a guy called Tom Panos, right? So Tom Panos is a really popular leading Sydney auctioneer, and he's got a fantastic YouTube channel where he does shorts. I watch every single one of them. Very entertaining, but he's also a very knowledgeable guy. And he's the guy who does the auctions on the block and that sort of stuff. And after last weekend's auction results, so he had, I think, 6 auctions, and every single one of them have passed in. And for the first time in 30 years, he said, he's been doing this for 30 years, he didn't get a single registered bidder on any of the auctions. So nobody even registered to bid on any of the homes. And he was quite shocked. Like, it was almost seemed like a panic stations, market rap that he did. Like, I've never seen him this negative on the housing market. He basically called it the worst housing market he's seen in 30 years. And that should tell you something. And he also mentioned, and I think he's right on this, that he said, forget about prices. It's the turnover that's the problem. And turnover has absolutely tanked. And when you get less turnover, it hurts the state budgets, obviously, because they're very stamp duty reliant. And he said, he mentioned that about 25% of state government revenue comes from stamp duty. It'd be probably higher in Victoria, where I am, and probably New South Wales as well. But that's been, wiped out. A lot of that's been wiped out now. And also, when you get less turnover, you get less, obviously, mortgage originations, which hurts the lenders, the banks, that sort of thing. Mortgage brokers, real estate agents get hit, removalists get hit. Harvey Norman sells less flat screen TVs because less people are moving house and upgrading stuff. So the lower volumes basically filters across the entire economy. And he reckons that's actually the bigger problem than falling prices, even though prices are falling as well. This is kind of, I wouldn't say it's uncharted waters, but that is, I think, where the more of the economic pain comes. And Panos made the point. He said, Treasurer Chalmers brought in these capital gains tax and negative gearing reforms, and Treasury forecast that's going to raise billions of dollars for the federal budget, but they haven't factored in, and this is what never happens, the Parliamentary Budget Office or anything like that with immigration or all these other things. They never factor in the impact on the state budgets. So they've brought in these changes to tax. It's obviously pushed the housing market into a deeper correction. It's reduced housing turnover as a result because there's less investors participating. And that means that the state budgets now get less. So the Feds get a bit more, according to Treasury, but the state budgets are getting less. So net, are we getting more government revenue? I don't know. Again, I personally don't care about the capital gains tax and negative gearing changes. I think they're necessary, just at least for property with capital gains. I don't like it on other things, but the timing of it probably wasn't great, right? You know, it would have been better to do it when you're in an upswing or when the market's hot to take heat out of the market. Probably not great to do it after the market's already in a correction phase, which it was, or entering a correction phase to then give it another shot, you know, downwards, which is what's happened basically. So yeah, I don't know. Should we go through some of the house price data quickly?
Yeah, just before we do that, one quick point, a little comment from earlier on saying in New Zealand, of course, not all markets are behaving the same way.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Right. Auckland, definitely down, but some of the South Island, actually quite strong. And I do think that's really important for people to understand that, you know, when it's important not just to talk averages, right?
Yeah.
There are some very significant dynamics. You know, in fact, it's Wellington in New Zealand that's dropped probably the most of anywhere, and that's partly because of the change in public servants. They're laying more public servants off now, even as we speak. So there are other factors here, but the general signals are still appropriate, aren't they?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So obviously, you know, medians and all that sort of stuff are they're just that, right? So it's a bit like, you know, if you got, I've used this example before, if you got the ASX 200 and the market falls, you know, a couple of percent in a day, that's a big downturn for the overall market.
Yeah.
But you're always going to have some companies that went up, right? So it's just it's a weighted average of the market, and it's the same with these. You know, we were talking about medians and the national median and that kind of thing. It's a weighted average of the market. So not everything's the same, but Tom Panos did say in his Sunday wrap, or Saturday wrap, I should say, he did also say he was laughing at the notion that Sydney's house prices have fallen 5%, because he goes, mate, because, you know, he's obviously in the areas, a lot of the areas he works, he says, mate, some of the areas he's in, the prices are down 25%. But then again, there'd be other areas which he doesn't work in where prices would have risen. They're probably the lower end of the market where they've got the 5% deposit scheme and that sort of thing, and they're more affordable. So those areas are holding up better. If you look at Cotality's data for June, it actually shows that the bottom 25% of the market is holding up pretty well. It's the top 25 that's getting hit hardest, and the middle is also falling now. But the lower end is actually holding up, and that's because that's where, you know, with investors being knocked out and they've had their borrowing capacity hit by about 30% or something, those investors that are still available, because they can't borrow as much, they're going to be looking at the lower end. Obviously, first home buyers with the 5% deposit scheme are going to be looking at the lower end. So everything's getting compressed towards that lower end, the demand. The upper end is getting absolutely smashed. And, you know, down my way, or, you know, a little bit further out from where I live in the Bellarine Peninsula, which is out past Geelong, Apollo Bay, and all those sorts of places, and also Mornington Peninsula. So they're all the seaside holiday destinations. There are so many homes available for sale, and the prices have absolutely crashed in those areas. And they crashed because the government brought in punitive land taxes, and a lot of them are holiday homes, so people can't afford to hold them anymore. So a lot of those properties, some of them down nearly 50%, from what I've read. So, you know, there are areas that are absolutely crashing, and then there are other areas that, again, these first home buyer areas are doing better. So, and certainly where I live, which is in the inner east of Melbourne, in a sort of, you know, it's definitely upper 25%. It's probably closer to 15% plus, maybe 10. The values in the area that I live are absolutely getting hammered. Again, I couldn't care less. But, you know, so yeah, it's a very interesting market. But what is definitely happening nationally, and that's if you look at the capital city medians, the correction is now broadening. So it started off as Sydney and Melbourne. In the last month or so, probably 6 weeks ago, it spread to Brisbane and Adelaide, and now Perth has joined the party as well. So yeah, got some data from Cotality, which shows that now the chart on the left, which is the rolling 20-day change, it's Adelaide's behaving a bit weird because it had a big decline, 1 day decline in home prices about 29 or 30 days ago, and then that dropped out of the series, and because it's only looking at 28 days, it's then done a bounce, but it's not a real bounce. So that's that purple line on the left. It just looks a bit weird. But you can see now that, home values in the last 28 days have fallen across every capital. Perth's about to go negative in the last 28 days. On the right-hand side, this is from Cotality, a couple of days old. So the chart on the left as of today's daily, which is Tuesday's daily dwelling values index. On the right-hand side was as of yesterday. You can see that both the regions now are falling as well in price. So in the last 28 days, regions are down 0.2%, capital cities down 0.8%. That's the combined capitals. Here's the interesting thing. So the house price correction, Perth's actually joined the party. Now, it's obviously very early on. In the last 7 days, up to today, every major capital city market has fallen. And in fact, when I taped another podcast about 5 or 6 days ago, it was all 5 capitals have fallen as well. The month to date change. So that's obviously what are we at today? The 28th? I can't remember. Yeah. So the first 28 days of, yes, it is. Sorry. The first 28 days of this month, values are down everywhere except for Perth. Perth's still slightly positive because it rose in the first bit of the month. But you can see values are down 0.8% across the 5-city aggregate level. Pretty big falls in Sydney and Melbourne now. They're falling at more than double-digit rates annually, if you annualise that. Brisbane's now posting solid falls as well, and Adelaide's a bit less. And the declines from peak on the right-hand side, Sydney and Melbourne are close to, well, Sydney's 5% now. It's fallen from peak, and Melbourne's down 4.8%. This is according to Cotality's daily index. And obviously the other 3 capitals have just joined recently. And across the 5 major capitals, the values are now down 2.2%. Now, I've mentioned previously that the biggest house price correction in the last 40 years nationally was about 8.2 or 8.3%, according to Cotality. So that's obviously that's the 5 capital cities. So that's not national. That doesn't count the regions and everything. But probably nationally now we're down about 2%. Right. So we're about a quarter of the way almost to the biggest downturn in 40 years. So we've obviously got a way to go, but the signs aren't great. We're only the early stages of the correction. The bigger news, and this is part of the reason why Tom Panos is panicking, is the auction market's been absolutely destroyed. So we've had 8 consecutive weeks of below 50% clearance rates nationally, and we're about to go 9 weeks because this data doesn't capture last weekend because we don't have the final results for that yet. That'll come out tomorrow, Wednesday or Thursday. But that's 8 consecutive weeks. You can see that in the left-hand chart, the combined capital city average. You've got auction clearance rates, tracking at, I think it was 48%, I think, combined capital cities so far in July. And you can see how low that is historically. You can also see what that usually means for prices because prices track auction clearance rates pretty closely. Sydney's absolutely toast. So the final clearance rate there is tracking at sort of mid to high 40% range. So obviously very weak, and prices are obviously reflecting that. Melbourne's slightly better. It has rebounded a bit, but their final clearance rate's still tracking at about 50%. So it's still very weak historically, and prices are reflecting that. And finally, I haven't previously posted Brisbane's clearance rate because Brisbane doesn't actually hold that many auctions compared to Sydney and Melbourne, but I've started tracking it. And Brisbane's auction market has absolutely collapsed. It's tracking at about 30% now. The clearance rate, which is just absolutely getting hammered. And you can see, even though auctions aren't as prevalent in Brisbane, it's still a pretty good leading indicator for prices. You can see them tracking pretty closely there. So Brisbane's, I wouldn't be surprised in a month or two if Brisbane's having a very heavy downturn, similar to Sydney and Melbourne. And to my earlier point on monthly sales, the latest Cotality data shows that sales volumes are tanking as well. That's the chart on the left. So you can see they're tracking below the 5-year average, or significantly below both, monthly terms and 6 months moving average. So this is one of the reasons why Tom Panos is, not happy at the moment, because auctioneers, real estate agents, etc., they live on turnover more than prices, and same with state governments. So it's not a good sign for them or for anybody who's volume dependent, or for the state government. On the right-hand side, this is about 2 weeks old, the Westpac Melbourne Institute the dwelling price expectations have fallen alongside house prices. You can see that pretty clearly in orange. So consumers are getting more negative on house prices, but it looks more like they're, rather than leading prices, they're just sort of reacting to prices. But here's the big one. Listings have absolutely surged across every single capital city market except for Hobart. So every mainland capital. You can see total listings in purple. So this is what this chart shows. It's from Cotality, released on Monday. It shows listings versus the same time last year. So the same time in July last year, the change in listings. You can see across the combined capital city, there's now 20% more homes for sale. And the big mover here is actually Brisbane. Look at Brisbane. Brisbane's listings are up 31% on the same time last year. That's a huge surge. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so negative on Brisbane property now. It had a massive rise in prices, where prices more than doubled over 6 years. It now has completely collapsing auction clearance rates. So that suggests that demand's very weak. And now listings are absolutely surging in Brisbane. And interestingly, Perth is now looking pretty weak on this metric, because Perth's listings are up 27.5% on last year. And that's been driven by new listings. So what that tells you is, whereas, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, even Adelaide to a degree, that's been more an accumulation of homes that are sort of old, have been listed for more than 30 days and aren't selling. Perth's their total listings are almost exactly the same as their new listings. So what that tells you is there's been a sudden change in sentiment in Perth, and people who've made out like bandits in the last few years are suddenly listing their homes. They're all piling into the market trying to get them sold and locking in their capital gains. Because as that chart showed earlier, Perth has only just entered the housing correction, right? So it's a very recent entry to the housing correction. Darwin as well looks very similar to Perth. New listings are surging. Actually, Canberra to an extent too. So this to me is kind of the biggest, I guess, I don't want to say leading, well, it's kind of the biggest indicator right now for house prices. You've got Perth, Adelaide, and Brisbane, which were the strongholds of the market, and were sort of bucking the trend while Sydney and Melbourne were falling, have now had these big jump in listings, which to me tells me those three markets are now entering, widespread correction phases. The other thing is the rental market's still running hot though. So as of the end of June, capital city rents are rising by about 6% annually. That's in the orange, and rental vacancy rates are still at historical lows. So it's still a really tight market. And capital city rents have risen by about 50% since the end of 2019. So they've absolutely surged, which is absolutely punishing renters. And unlike for sale listings, rental listings are actually still falling, which is quite extraordinary. So across the combined capital cities, the number of homes listed for rent is actually down 9.3% on the same time last year. And you can see that, like all the pink or purple bars there are all down significantly on last year, except in Hobart, which is slightly higher, and I guess Darwin and Canberra aren't down that much. But the rental market is just tightening still, and so we've got this kind of this market where Australia's still not building enough homes. We've got the construction sector is completely bottlenecked. The government's still bringing in too many people through immigration, and that's tightening the rental market. But on the other side of the coin, because of the constriction in credit, the rise in interest rates, the fact that affordability is just so stretched, and now we've got the negative gearing and capital gains tax changes, prices are tanking. And another interesting set of charts here, Australia now has the highest mortgage rates. Well, I can't say it is the highest, it's probably a country somewhere, but amongst the very highest mortgage rates in the advanced world. That chart's from Justin Farber and Paddy Macro. So you can see there, Australia in black. The mortgage rates here are higher than just about anywhere else. And the reason for that is that the RBA is obviously in a tightening cycle, and our interest rates are at the highest level in about 15 years, equal highest level in 15 years, whereas the central banks in the other jurisdictions have cut their rates. And mortgage stress, and I know you track this differently, Martin, but the Roy Morgan mortgage stress indicator is tracking at its equal highest since the global financial crisis now. So mortgage holders are now under more pressure, and I know you track this very closely, and your figures are probably showing exactly the same thing. But obviously, we've got high interest rates, or high mortgage rates likely to go even higher, and mortgage stress building. And as you mentioned earlier, the financial markets are actually pricing in one more rate hike this year. So that situation's, should that come to fruition, the mortgage stress is going to get even worse. Because obviously the cash rate will hit 4.6%. The mortgage rate will hit, what's that, about 6.75, I think it is, if we get the cash rate of that. And one of the things that'll have the RBA concerned is that last week's labour force release was incredibly strong. So, we added 76,000 jobs. Now, of course, there's number wang in this. There always is. But the unemployment rate, is stuck at 4.4%. And Michelle Bullock says she wants it to go higher, or it needs to go higher to bring inflation down. Well, it's not. It's not going. Last week's labour force release was strong, and other things equal.
Not in Melbourne.
No. We'll get on that later. Melbourne's a special case, but nationally, and obviously the RBA looks at the national when they set monetary policy. And the RBA released a survey about a week ago, and that's the chart in the bottom right, where they actually gauged the economic concerns of Australians. And interestingly, the number one economic concern was inflation, and that beat housing, it beat interest rates, even though interest rates and inflation are linked. And that to me tells you that if the RBA thinks that people are concerned about inflation, and they're the one body in Australia that can actually influence inflation, because the federal government's not going to do it. They're not operating fiscal policy to try and trim inflation. And the labour market's obviously very strong. It's more likely that the RBA is going to hike rates. Now, the key next piece of data we get is actually tomorrow, when we get the June CPI. And if the true mean inflation, which I think was 3.4% at the last reading, I think the quarterly was 3.4% in March. I usually go by the quarterly; it's just a bit more reliable. Now, if that shoots higher tomorrow, well, then I think it's very, very likely that we could. It becomes very likely that we could actually get a rate hike next month. If we get a bad inflation result with this, I can't say it's bad, but bad from an inflation perspective, labour force result, and Australians are concerned about inflation, and they're telling the RBA that. Well, that to me tells you that the RBA is going to be more likely to hike interest rates.
It's an alibi for them, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they can. Yeah, and I'm sure when they put it out last week, because this was all over Twitter and all that sort of stuff, they would have been doing that for a reason.
Yeah.
Right. To say, we've surveyed Australians, you are concerned about this, and they're the one institution in Australia that's their main MO is to control that.
Yep. They've been unsuccessful for 5 or 6 years in terms of getting it back to where it needs to be. So it's all over the place, really. Interestingly, Westpac, as I think I said, have now forecast a higher inflation number coming in tomorrow.
Yep.
And they are forecasting at least 1, maybe 2 rate rises through this year. And mortgage stress, as you say, on my numbers, it's pretty much as high as it's ever been. The thing to note, though, it's longevity. There are more households who've been in problems for a longer period of time. And that's relevant because mortgage stress is not something that immediately tips something over, in a month or two. It can take months or even years. The longer this goes on, the more likely it is that more people will be forced to sell, will be trying to find a way out. With the price rises that they've had over the recent years, many people will still be able to sell and get out and repay the bank, despite the fact they may have nowhere to live. So that's something to watch. That's why the default rates are still quite low at the moment, because of the property prices. But if property prices do come back, let's say they come back 20 to 30%, that will change the default story dramatically.
Yeah, and Roy Morgan often mentions that the key driver of mortgage stress isn't actually interest rates. Like, that's obviously a big driver, but it's actually unemployment.
Yeah.
So obviously, if we get it's not obviously looking like it right now, but unless you're in Victoria, but if we get a big jump in unemployment, well, then that's obviously going to, interest rates aside, that's going to drive up mortgage stress, other things equal, because you obviously need a job to be able to pay your mortgage.
Yeah, absolutely. So the fascinating thing about all this, Leith, is that we know this is the property market element, but you've got to embed it in the broader issue of productivity, investment, growth, all of those things. The Reserve Bank is caught because the economy is sluggish. Growth is very slow. The spare capacity in the economy is close to zero at the moment. Part of that is because more and more of the lending from the banks has been thrown into property, which means that less and less is available for other more productive uses in the economy, which is why this whole question of how you turn the tiller around towards productivity becomes the critical question. I would argue that actually a reduction in home prices and therefore bank lending for mortgages is actually a productive event.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mentioned this on previous shows. If you go back to the late 80s, early 90s, banks used to lend about 60%, I think it was, for businesses.
2/3. Yep.
Yeah, that's right. About 2/3 was for business, and the rest was for about 25% was for mortgages, and the rest was for personal lending.
Yep.
And now it's completely done a flip, where it's basically 60% for mortgages now, and then it's personal lending, and then very little actually for business lending. So that just kind of shows you how Australia's economy has been, warped over a 30 plus year period, where the banks are basically, there's a lot of things to blame for this. Part of this is probably the Basel Capital Accord, which incentivized banks to lend to mortgage lending because they could hold way less capital, and that was brought in 1988.
Yes.
That was the first Basel One, and then they expanded to Basel Two, which is basically when I was at Treasury. They were doing that. I worked on that actually at Treasury back in the early 2000s, and then now there's been iterations of that ever since. But that whole capital accord has biased international bank lending, not just in Australia. And it's one of the reasons why we've had a global house price boom, because it hasn't just been in Australia; it's been across a lot of countries. We've had these global house prices surge sort of in the late 90s onwards. And a lot of that was the financial deregulation story that supplemented by the Basel Capital Accord, etc. So there's been a whole bunch of factors. But in Australia's case, we've also had dumb tax rules that were, obviously reducing the capital gains tax, or the capital gains tax discount added a bit of a kick to it. In 1999, mass migration. We've had umpteen stimulus type packages with first home buyers grants and all this other crap that the governments have been doing for decades. And we've just created a economy now that's become basically a housing bubble with an economy attached, to borrow a term from Bernard Hickey at interest.co.New Zealand. It's the same in New Zealand, and then probably similar in Canada as well, and a whole bunch of other countries. Unfortunately, that means you have a low productivity economy, because you end up getting less business investment. That's exactly what we've had. We've had very poor business investment outside the mining sector, especially in the last decade or so, or more than a decade. And it's one of the reasons why we've got poor productivity, because at the same time as we've had poor business investment, we've had very high population growth through immigration. So the way you measure capital deepening, which is basically happens when you provide your workers with more capital, which is like, tools and machinery, technology, infrastructure, all sorts of things. When you provide more of that, people become more productive, right? But when you provide less of that per worker, or the growth in that is less, you get less productivity growth. And that's effectively what's happened to Australia. We've had a prolonged period of weak business investment at the same time as, which is the numerator of the capital to labour ratio, but while we've grown the denominator aggressively through mass migration. So effectively had less capital growth and more people growth, which means per person, the capital per worker has fallen. And that's one of the reasons why I've had such poor productivity growth. And to turn that stuff around, you need to do a whole bunch of things. Like, you need to obviously rejig the economy away from housing into actually productive investment. You need broad-based tax reform that actually encourages investment and stops overtaxing work, and basically dust off the Henry tax review and implement it. Those sorts of reforms. You need obviously smaller government. We can't keep having government spending like drunken sailors and boosting the non-market economy, which is what we've done. We've had, especially in the last decade or so, we've had massive growth in the government-funded sector of the economy, which is very low productivity. And in fact, productivity growth in that sector, in the non-market sector, is actually lower than it was 20 years ago. And that's directly, you know, curtailed the nation's growth. And we also need a much smaller and better quality migration system that's not built around quantity, it's built around quality. So we should be taking in fewer migrants that are more skilled on average. And if we did that, you wouldn't need as much business investment because you'd have less people for that to provide that business investment too, and infrastructure investment and all these other things, which would mean that you get capital deepening and also mean that the average quality of migrant would be higher, so they'd be more productive as well. So they bring more skills to the country and fill genuine skill shortages and be more productive in their work. And they'd end up earning more and paying higher taxes and that sort of thing. So those are the sorts of things we need as a nation. But will we get it? Because we have, and I should have, I'd be remiss if I didn't say we also need sensible energy policy that actually lowers the cost of energy in Australia. Because at the moment we've got energy policy that's directed towards increasing energy prices in Australia. And if you do that, you deindustrialise, which is what we're doing. Your manufacturing sector and other things, which have traditionally been one of the strongest areas of productivity growth, end up shrinking and moving offshore, which is what we've got. And then you just become more service orientated into low productivity areas, which is what we've got in government and those sorts of things. So we also need sensible energy policy that actually brings down the cost of energy, not increases it, which we don't have, unfortunately. So those are the sorts of things we need governments to do. Unfortunately, I don't see our government's policymakers, either at a state or federal level, moving in that direction. In fact, in most areas, they make things worse. And I don't have a lot of trust in any institutions anymore. I think, for example, the Australian Treasury are hopeless nowadays. Totally different to when I was there. I'm not saying they were perfect when I was there, but back 20 years ago, they were at least aware of these issues. Now, I think they seem to just tell the government you spend like drunken sailors, it doesn't matter. Mass migration is good. Net zero doesn't implement any cost on the economy, and it's costless, which is complete garbage. There's no trade-offs to it. Seems to be their philosophy nowadays. Whereas the old Treasury that I was at would have said, you can do this, but there's a cost involved, and you need to be upfront about the cost, and you need to do a cost-benefit analysis about whether net zero is worth it. Like, it's costly to do this. Whereas the current Treasury, the BS modelling they brought out on net zero last year was just basically, you do net zero and everything's better and the economy is going to grow stronger, which is just absolutely moronic and is not going to happen, and it hasn't happened anywhere in the world that's tried this stuff. So yeah, these are unfortunately, we've got very poor institutions in this country now. The Productivity Commission's a joke as well. They used to be great under Gary Banks. In the old days, now I wouldn't trust anything they write pretty much. And the level of policy making is reflecting the poor inputs from our agencies and our institutions.
Yeah, I just want to touch a little bit on this whole issue of modelling and information. There was a very interesting post that I put up a little while ago about the CPI and the way the CPI is connected and not connected to land values and property values and those sorts of things. But it's a microcosm of a much bigger problem. The modelling that is being used by the Treasury is broken. I think it's severely broken. And
terrible.
The reason for that being so critical is they are turned to as the experts in helping policymakers decide what to do. And it seems to me that so often now the modelling is being done to support a political point of view that the politicians are wanting to try and prove, rather than actually fearless advice based on reality, which I think is an observation. And I'll make the point here. Andy Burnham has just come in as the new PM in the UK. And in the first week, he said some really interesting things. The first one was, the last 40 years in the UK has gone off the rails. We've actually made major mistakes. And he's shooting a lot of those to the way that the Treasury was working or not working, the way that investment was made or not made, and a whole bunch of other issues. Now, some have taken that to mean, well, he's saying neoliberalism is the problem. Maybe it's part of the problem, but it's a much bigger issue. It's fundamentally about the way the decisions are being taken and the political processes and how they're connected to the way that advice is provided by Treasury. That's the fundamental question that I think has to be looked at.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you call it the civil service over there. Yeah, Catherine Porter, who's an excellent energy analyst in the UK, has made this point that basically the UK civil service is broken. They're ideologues, and they don't look at things rationally, and they're not pragmatic on policy. And I think it's very similar here. And I see it all the time in the net zero debate and all this sort of stuff. We've just got ideologues in charge. And a whole bunch of other areas. Like immigration is another thing. Like, immigration is good no matter what. And it's like, well, no, it's got to be the right size and it's got to be the right quality. And we haven't got either of those things right. We've had a ridiculous, been far too big for the past 20 years. It's also been the quality of immigration has gotten progressively worse. And I think that's pretty self-evident. And as a result, we're suffering from a productivity perspective, we're suffering from a livability perspective, and it's just not working. And this is one of the reasons why Australians are getting angry, right? And, you know, it's not just immigration, obviously, but Australia's productivity growth has been amongst the poorest in the OECD in the last decade. And we've had our growth in real per capita household disposable income, which is the number one measure of material living standards. It's not obviously not everything, right? There's other things that fall outside of this, not just, there's a whole bunch of quality of life indicators that doesn't measure. But in just pure money sense, it's the number one indicator for material living standards. Well, Australia's growth in real per capita household disposable income has been so far below the OECD average in the last decade that it's not funny. So Australia is basically a stagnating economy. Like low productivity, low growth, low living standards. Well, it's not low living in an absolute sense, but the improvement in living standards just isn't happening. In fact, they're going backwards. And this is something that we should all be worried about. And unfortunately, a lot of it does get back to poor analysis and poor briefing from our institutions, whether they be the climate, the climate and energy department, whatever they're called, Department of Climate and Energy and Climate Change, whether it's the Australian Treasury or all these other areas, that the advice has been poor. And the modelling's been poor. And I'll give you one area where the modelling is incredibly ridiculous. The Parliamentary Budget Office brought out their annual report on the outlook for the medium-term outlook for the budget. And they had a whole section on immigration. And they did some modelling where it showed that if Australia cuts immigration by 40,000 per year, so it's not actually cut, it means immigration's 40,000 fewer than what the current forecast is. So this year it's like 260,000. Well, that would mean it'd be 220, for example. They forecast that if we did that, the federal budget would lose tens of billions of dollars, right? It'd be much worse off and less of stuff. Well, Tarek Brooker and I actually went into the Build Your Own Budget tool, and it's complete farce. Like, it literally ignores the cost side of the equation. Like, there's a few costs it measures, but it basically ignores almost all costs, or most of the costs that are associated with immigration. Like, for example, just for fun, I inputted running an extra 1 million net overseas migrants for the next 11 years. So we're going to add an extra 11 million people to Australia's population. And the extra cost to the budget in 2035, 36, or in 11 years' time was minuscule. And for example, it actually forecasts that the cost of the NDIS will fall, not rise, with an extra 11 million people. It forecast that there'll be no change in the number of public servants, despite having 11 million extra people. So we're going to add a Sydney and a Melbourne extra people on top of what was already forecast, just in migration, according to these inputs that are put in there. And yet, the federal budget will be better off by about $500 million, according to their numbers. But the expense side of the equation, like the expenses will barely rise. Like this ridiculous Parliamentary Budget Office tool literally forecast, no matter what you do with immigration, if you input it, any rise in immigration, you basically get 8 to 9 times the revenue benefit as you do the extra expenses.
Mm.
So what I mean by that is roughly for every $8.50 to $9 of extra revenue you get from raising immigration, the costs only go up by $1, which doesn't make any sense. Like if we were to add 11 million people through extra people on top of what they already forecast through immigration in 11 years, which is what I did with my numbers, that's another Sydney and Melbourne. How many schools and hospitals and all this other infrastructure and trains and metro stations and all the stuff you need to cope with another 11 million people would you have to build? But the Parliamentary Budget Office ignores all that, which just means it makes no sense, right? And what this modelling basically said, and it was picked up by all the mainstream media and all this sort of stuff, and they used it over the weekend to try and ridicule One Nation's policies, because One Nation wants to lower net overseas migration to 130,000 a year. And they said, oh, if you did that, that's going to be about 100,000 less a year. The cost is going to be, it's going to cost the economy this much based on the Parliamentary Budgets Office. It's like, hang on, yeah, but if you had 100,000 fewer net overseas migrants over a decade, that's a million people. Fewer people you need. How much less infrastructure would you need with that 1 million fewer people? The NDIS would be lower. You'd save all these other costs. And every dollar of infrastructure you don't need to build is a dollar saved, right? By running a smaller migration program. Yet the Parliamentary Budget Office basically ignores all that. Mm. And they just go, oh, you're going to get less income tax receipts and you're going to get less company tax and you're going to get less GST payments. Therefore, and excise and whatever. Therefore, therefore Australia's worse off, without ignoring the benefit of having lower immigration by not having to build all this extra stuff, the extra energy, the extra water desalination plants, all this other stuff you got to build when you grow your population. That's very expensive, that stuff. And there's just one other thing that was ridiculous. The amount of corporate tax that you get scales with the population. So, for example, with the million migrants example I did, over 11 years, it's 11 million people. The company tax just goes up proportionally. But about a quarter to a third of Australia's total company tax is from minerals and resources, right? And mineral and resources, the amount of exports of coal, iron ore, gas, all this other stuff that we sell is independent of the population size. So if Australia had 20 million people, not 28 million people, we still sell the same amount of exports, roughly, of coal and gas and everything. And these mining firms, the resource companies, would pay about the same amount of corporate tax because the demand for those products is exogenous, which means it comes from overseas. And it's independent of how big the population here is domestically. And because the mining sector is capital intensive, it has very few workers, it operates independently of the size of Sydney and Melbourne and all these other places where most of the population goes. Yet the PBO doesn't adjust for that, because what it should do is, as the population scales up with immigration, the share of company tax should actually shrink, because you're going to be spreading your fixed mineral endowment, your fixed exports of coal and natural gas and all the other stuff that we sell in the resource sector will be getting diluted amongst more people, which means that you get less per capita. Right? But it doesn't adjust for any of this stuff. So this is why I don't trust any of this crap that comes out of Treasury. I think they're full of it. And this is Parliamentary Budget Office, to be fair, it's not Treasury. But I don't trust any of these agencies to actually measure this stuff properly, because you just have to look at their model. And look, to the PBO's credit, they do actually give you the spreadsheet and you can play around the numbers. Like that's good. But it just shows you how rancid it is. That you can grow the population aggressively and the NDIS will magically become cheaper, according to the PBO. Like, just think about that for a sec. Like, Australia can just solve its problems we should just run immigration by 1 million every year, according to the PBO. And if that was true, we'd be the richest country on earth. And in fact, why do 1 million? Let's do 5 million a year, because it's just all gain and no costs, according to the PBO. Like, it just scales. Like, you could put in 5 million, put in 10 million. Shit, we might as well let's go for 1 billion people in Australia, because using this crap modeling, we'd just be the richest country on earth if we did that. like this, it's nonsensical. It doesn't pass the laugh test. And yet these sorts of figures just get put out by PBO or whatever, and they get parroted in the mainstream media, and then suddenly you got, a dozen articles saying, the true costs of cutting immigration and why one nation, blah, 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 and how they're going to set Australia onto ruin and all this sort of stuff. And I just sort of look at it going, we've been running this crap mass migration policy for 20 years.
Yeah.
Has it made us better? Are we a more productive economy? The state, our state governments are just drowning in debt now. And one of the reasons why they're drowning in debt, outside of WA, which is resources heavy, is because the federal government has piled people in to the states, and the states have a very narrow revenue base. The feds collect most of the money, and the states are left having to build the infrastructure, provide the services, and all the stuff that's required for population growth. And as a result, they're drowning in debt, and they've kept their heads above water in the short term over the last 10 to 20 years, or in a temporary sense, by selling off assets. So we've basically privatized everything, and now we've sold all the family silver, and we're swimming naked with these state governments that are hugely indebted, trying to keep up with the mass population growth that the feds have bestowed on them. The feds get the benefits through the company tax and the personal income taxes and all that sort of stuff, even though the company tax gets diluted, as I just explained. But all the costs, well, most of the costs fall on the states. And the Parliamentary Budget Office ignores that. Treasury ignores that. It's like that's the state's problem. So I'm not going to worry about it. Right? But they should worry about that, because we're in the end, where Australia is one country, and what happens in the states matters, what happens in the federal government matters. We should be looking at the whole picture, the holistic picture here. But nobody does that.
Now, this is critical. And interestingly, I'm just thinking about one example, right? Water supply. So if you brought another million people in, you're going to need some more reservoirs, right? You're going to need more desal plants, more infrastructure. And the interesting question is, what assumption is being made about that, and who would pay for that? Because there's a huge cost there, right? And
it's ignored.
Yeah. Most of that, of course, is now in the private sector. So they're assuming the market will solve that. And that's
a cost to us.
Yeah, exactly right. And so that's why I get a bit frustrated. And I've said a few times, the problem is if you just leave it to the markets and assume the markets will sort of figure it out, at the end of the day, those costs come sheeting back to the cost of living for individuals, if it happens at all.
Yep.
Or you don't end up with the water supply that you need, or the roads that you need, and you just get more and more congestion and less ability to be able to do the things you want to do. That's the problem that we've got. So in a way, the government, by pushing everything over there and saying, not my problem, the federal government's responsibility is this little bit here, it's not the whole thing. Nobody's got the joined up picture.
No.
And as a result of that, you end up with an economic model that they try to justify a particular policy position that's completely broken.
It's a rat wheel economy. It's just, spinning harder, but you're not going anywhere. And in fact, you're going backwards in the case of us. And like Sydney's, well, and Melbourne as well, but Sydney's a classic example there to a lot of, so I've mentioned this before. When I used to go and visit my cousin back in the 80s and 90s when I was a kid, we used to always drive up and whatever. And, back then, Sydney had very few toll roads. It had there was always the Harbour Bridge. The Harbour Bridge had a toll road back then, and I think there was one near the airport. I can't remember what it was called. But I think you might have had two toll roads back then. I'm talking about the late 90s or something. Now you drive around Sydney, it's toll road central, right? And it's toll road central because, they've privatised a lot of stuff, but also Sydney's population has grown by over 1.5 million people this century so far, and it's obviously built out. So they've had to build these tunnel road projects and all that sort of stuff, and they end up being tolled. So now, in order to get around Sydney, it's arguably harder than it was in the 90s when there was fewer people, but you pay more for the privilege of getting around Sydney because now you have to drive on toll roads that you only need because you brought in all these extra people. And that whether you're paying $1 to the state government or the federal government, or you're paying it to Transurban, it's still coming out of your pocket, right? Yep. So we just basically, substituted regular taxes, which are paid to state and feds or local government and rates, for private taxes, which are user pays charges, which we now pay a lot more user pays than we used to because we've privatised everything. And they end up just going to Transurban or Macquarie Bank or whatever, right? But in the end, it doesn't matter if it's a private tax or it's a public tax, a regular traditional tax. It's still coming out of your pocket and it's still a cost of living hit.
Mm.
And a lot of this stuff has been rat wheel economy stuff where the government just brings in loads of people, piles them into the capital cities. The state governments try to kind of keep pace with the population growth by doing all these, mega infrastructure projects and all the other crap they do. They never do keep up. So we always fall in further behind, but you end up just paying more, right? So the average cost of everything just goes up. And Sydney Water has warned that Sydney's water prices are going to rocket because of all the extra people and all the extra housing estates and all the extra homes and all the whatever. And they've got to augment the water supply, i.e. desalination plants. That's just going to push up the average water bill. And you wouldn't need to push up the average water bill if you didn't do the immigration in the first place. You didn't grow Sydney aggressively. And according to the Centre for Population's forecasts, Melbourne by 2065, 66, the financial year 2066, is supposed to be 9.1 million people. And Sydney's supposed to be 8.5 million people. So Sydney's going to add nearly just under 3 million people by 2066. Melbourne's going to add, 3.6 million people by 2066, according to their forecasts. Well, that's going to cost a lot of money, right? And it's going to need a hell of a lot of infrastructure. And it's going to need a whole bunch of stuff. And if you don't get that stuff, your living standards are going to go backwards. And it's going to cost a lot, which we're going to have to end up paying for. And again, these costs are completely ignored in the immigration modelling, whether it's the parliamentary budget offices or it's the intergenerational reports modelling, ignored that stuff. It only looked at the federal government, or even the fiscal impacts of New Australians, which is Treasury's model, which is supposed to look at the state government impacts, but doesn't. And ridiculously, that model says that immigration's positive for state budgets as well. It's complete crap. I looked in that model. It makes no sense. It's just got all these BS assumptions that don't stand up to scrutiny. But, all the modeling's junk, right? And it's all geared towards encouraging the government to run high migration because it's good for the federal budget.
Yeah.
Which immigration is good for the federal budget. Don't get me wrong, it is. Because the feds collect, 3/4 of the states of the nation's taxes. It used to be 80%. I just found out it's actually gone down to about 3/4 now. But it collects the lion's share of the taxes. So it gets the benefits of immigration mostly through the extra personal income tax. But the costs, again, are pushed onto the states and onto private citizens through user pays charges after things have been privatised and that kind of thing.
Mm.
But you need to look at the big picture. Like it's a cost nevertheless.
Yeah, and just to underscore, the user pays for a lot. Our taxes are higher than they've been as well, despite Chalmers' 5 tax cuts 3 ways, which is, very, very marginal cuts. The overall tax take seems to rise. And when you actually look at that and overlay that with the cost of property, whether you're paying a mortgage or whether you're renting, it's not surprising that more and more people are struggling with trying to balance money in, money out, because it's just ever increasing. And the trajectory is set. That's the point. This isn't a short-term blip. It isn't just the Hormuz situation, the price of oil, that will put another process that's going to put probably more inflation into the system. This other stuff, this is structural, because it's been a set of decisions that have been taken again over the last 40 years or so to take us into this situation where the system is not working for ordinary people.
No, and unfortunately, it's become we've kind of been boiled slowly, right? And unfortunately, especially since COVID, I think obviously this has been building for a long time, but since COVID, the interference from the governments have been extreme, and the bloat in the public service, the notion that it's okay to just tax us more and more every year, and we've become our governments now just look to redistribute rather than try and actually grow. Right? They're not trying to grow the pie anymore. They're trying to basically redistribute the pie in ways that they see fit. And ultimately, if you do that, you end up just fighting for scraps, which is what we've been doing. Right? So where we we need a government to get back to trying to minimize the role of government in our lives and let the private sector and entrepreneurs and what have you, become the key drivers of the economy again. Because at the moment, it's governments that are trying to be the key drivers of the economy, and in the end, all they do is redistribute.
Mm.
And they don't actually create anything, and often they make our lives worse and they actually lower productivity, which is what we're seeing in the productivity statistics. Like very poor because of the capital shallowing stuff that I will mention, but it's also poor because we've bloated the size of the non-market economy, which is basically the government-funded sector. It's not just public servants, also other government-funded jobs in the notional private sector. But that area of the economy has been the fastest area of jobs growth for a long time now. And it's also the area where productivity today is less than it was 20 years ago, whereas at least the market sector of the economy still had productivity growth, and that's actually been decent. It's been reasonable. Not great, but reasonable. And we need to shrink the size of the public service. I'm not talking about nurses and teachers, the frontline public servants. I'm talking about the back office bureaucrats. We need so many fewer back office bureaucrats. We need to downsize Canberra massively. We need to downsize the state government's back office bureaucrats. Because this is one thing, Martin, it's never made sense to me. I don't know if I said this to you before, but I've said it previously in other interviews. But if you're running a managed fund, right, you shouldn't need twice the staff to manage $1 billion in funds under management as $100 million because it scales, right? You just end up buying bigger blocks of Microsoft shares or whatever than you would have otherwise. So you can pretty much do everything on the same amount of staff. You might need a few extra for compliance or whatever, but not a lot. You basically don't need to scale up the funds under management with the number of people who run that fund, right? It should be the same, similar in the public service. Now, I'm not talking about frontline public servants. I don't even call them public servants, like nurses and teachers and doctors and all that sort of stuff. I'm talking about the bureaucrats, right? How is it that the bureaucracy in Australia has grown faster than population growth in the last, at least the last decade, if not 20 years? If anything, it should have been the other way around, because you don't need the number of people at the Treasury, for example, or the Department of Climate Change or whatever the hell it's called, or all these other bloody departments we've got millions of them. They don't need to grow faster than the population. They don't even need to grow as fast as the population. Like, we should be able to, the Treasury should be the same size today as it was in 2003 and to 2006 when I was there, because it's still doing the same stuff. It's just working with bigger numbers because we've got a bigger economy. It's not doing more stuff, right? And with technology and, nothing's paper-based anymore like it was in the 80s. And if anything, we should have had more staff back then because everything was paper-based. You needed more, it was more manual. Now things are automatic. So you should be able to do more with less. But instead we're doing less with more. And this is one of the reasons why, we've got such poor productivity growth. And what I also hate is that when you have more bureaucrats, it just means they're incentivized to interfere more in your life because they need something to do. And they need to be able to justify their life. And I was watching the John Anderson podcast. He interviewed David Pearl, who's a former senior Treasury official. He left the Treasury a few years back, and he's been very critical. It's a really good interview. If you want to see how the Treasury has devolved from being used to be a pretty good agency that did robust analysis back when I was there 20 odd years ago, to being absolutely captured, useless ideologues. Go and listen to that interview. Like, he's very scathing of the Treasury, just especially on climate change and a whole bunch of other things, and immigration and a whole bunch of areas. What was I saying? Dave, John Anderson. Now I haven't checked his figures because I want to check him after I listen to it today. He reckons that there's like 5,000 people working in the Department of Energy and Climate Change. 5,000 people. Why do you need 5,000 people working in that area? Like, if you were to ask me before this show started, Leith, how many people do you reckon should be working in the Department of Energy and Climate Change? I would have said maybe 500 max. But according to John Anderson, at least, now I haven't checked his numbers again, he reckons there's 5,000. Like, it's probably the same across all these departments in Canberra and a lot of the state government departments. Like, we need to cut them heavily and release those resources into the private sector, and people can work in real jobs rather than these BS public funded jobs. just basically creating more rules to make our lives annoying. You know, it's just insane. And John Anderson made the good point. He said, well, we had these 5,000 people. Why the hell wasn't one of those 5,000 people studying on how to make our fuel security, you know, robust? Because before the whole war with Iran happened, we had like 30 days of liquid fuels in Australia, which is the lowest in the lowest in the advanced world. Like we were the most exposed to a fuel shortage. How the hell does that happen? Like, why aren't there one of the 5,000 idiots working on, because they're probably all working on net zero, right? They're all sitting there going to meetings and going, yeah, net zero, you know, whatever, you know, massaging each other and this sort of stuff. Whispering sweet net zero nothings into each other's ears rather than doing actually something productive. Like ensuring that Australia has a stable supply of liquid fuel so that we can actually feed ourselves, operate our mines, operate our farms when we have global supply disruptions. Like that, you know, that would have been pretty important, I think. But instead we worry about all this other garbage, this virtue signaling stuff. And it just does my head in. And, you know, see, so we're all stuck here paying really high income taxes that we're just getting slaughtered by bracket creep. We've got the top marginal tax rate now that kicks in at 1.9 times median full-time earnings, which is very low. And it's just going to get worse and worse every single year as bracket creep kicks in and that threshold isn't increased. So we're just all getting taxed more. To do what? To what fund 5,000 people in the Department of Energy and Climate Change to go and whisper sweet nothings in each other's ears and you know, tout the virtues of net zero and all these other stupid departments that could, let's be honest, could probably operate in 1/10 the freaking number of people if they had to, especially with all the technology we've got now. Like, why do we have this bureaucratic bloat? And there's been a whole bunch of articles I've read recently which saying that most of the federal public servants now don't even come to work. They all work from home. Like, you know, half of them should be sacked. Like downsize the crap out of it and release those people into the private sector. Like, you know, we always have these complaints about labor shortages. Well, if that's even true, we've got a whole bunch of resources that have been wasted working in the bureaucracies. Right? We just got too many of them. And our public service or civil service, as you call it in the UK, is just too big, too wasteful, and it needs to be cut back. And especially in this age of, you know, budget austerity, where the federal budget's facing, you know, decade of deficits, and the state budgets are even worse, especially in my neck of the woods. Well, one way you can actually do something about that is to actually cut the number of heads in the public service. Again, I'm not talking about teachers and nurses and frontliners. Those need to scale with the population. If anything, we should be cutting the number of bureaucrats and putting more money into those areas. Right? We need less back office bureaucrats and more people in other areas of the economy that actually do things. How about that?
A little post just came in. Should we call it for what it is? Economic vandalism, right? Because when you actually stand back and just think about it and think of all the things we'll be talking about, you know, the place is wrecked, but it's been wrecked by people who actually have made bad decisions because of all of the things we've been talking about. Now, is it intentional or is it an accident? What do you think?
I think it's a bit of both, actually. So I think definitely since the pandemic, the governments have learnt that they can get away with it, basically, right? Especially where I'm from in Victoria, right? Like the governments with their lockdowns and all this other crap, and the fact that the Victorian government was rewarded with a bigger majority the last election after doing this to us, it's just empowered them. It's empowered the idiocy. It's empowered the I don't want to say dictatorial, you know, type of government, but authoritarian. It's probably going a bit too far, but you know, it has empowered our policymakers to become more interventionist in our lives, right? So I think a part of it definitely is deliberate, unfortunately. I think if the pandemic hadn't hit and never had happened, I don't think we'd have a bureaucracy that's as bad as it is now, or because the governments wouldn't have thought they could get away with it as much as they are. It'd still be broken, but I don't think it would be as broken as it is now. Put it that way.
Absolutely. Well, I reckon we've come close to the end of the show. Coming back to where we started this, we think the property bust is going to be in train for a little while. In a second, I'm going to reveal what the poll said. But you, I think, would probably agree with me that it's likely to be longer than 6 months or even 12 months. This is going to be potentially a multi-year event.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Look, I think we might get a decent length solid correction, and then probably might
Sideways.
have years of nothingness, or a bit like Melbourne's had in the last. So we had declines during the pandemic, whatever, and then we had a few little bounces, and then it's come down again, bounce, come down, whatever. But once you adjust it for inflation, Melbourne's just been down for the last 6 years, really.
Yeah.
Might even be 7. I just can't remember exactly the dates. Although it has had a few little bounces along the way, but then it's just resumed its falls. So I wouldn't be surprised if nationally we kind of do what's happened to Melbourne in the last 5 years, although a steeper correction at the start. So yeah, I think I'm hoping that the days of the endless house price growth and that are over, and the reason why I'm hoping that it's over is because I've got 2 teenage kids who'll need housing in the next 10 years. So yes, I'm talking from self-interest, right? I am. Because I don't want, there's nothing I'd hate more is if Melbourne went on a run and rose by 30% or something in the next, 10 years while my kids are looking, and then I've got to do bank and mum and dad and help them into the market, right? I'll have to help them anyway, but I'd rather help them more modestly than more generously, put it that way. So yes, I'm hoping that we get a decade of nothingness in the housing market, or I'm hoping in a decade's time the price to income ratio is significantly lower than it is now. Put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it is, I think, very, very important that we don't get another rush up in prices. Going back to this productivity issue, if it moves the other way, it's good for the broader economy and potentially will provide a momentum to the broader economy. And as you say, the other structural issues are definitely critical. And thanks very much to Onselen for all the super chats and also the commentary. Very, very important there. Okay. Let's have a little look at the poll. What did the poll say? Okay. How long will the current property bust last? Less than 6 months, 8%. 6 months to a year, 21%. More than a year, 71%. So I think the bulk of the people following the show here, Leith, are in our camp. This is going to be longer than just a short-term blip. And I think that is quite an important little observation in terms of what we see. And, with all of these things, who knows? We might get a major international crisis, even more than the Middle East, or the massive stock market crash or something. But unless that happens, I think we're going to see property prices in any case very much in negative territory. So this is a bust with a run time that's way longer than just a few weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. And just bearing in mind that the so-called biggest housing correction in 40 years, according to Cotality, was 2017 to 2019. So I think that ran about 2 years. It might have been slightly less than 2 years. Maybe it was 18 months. But it was between those 2 years. So by memory, it was just after the May budget 2019 it ended, when Shorten didn't get in and he didn't do the negative gearing and capital gains tax changes, and the Bank and Roll Commission had finished. And then ScoMo came in and basically said, no, all that stuff's off the table, and the market just rebounded, remember?
Yeah.
But that had been, close to 2 year correction then. So even if we just play that out again, we've still got, at least 18 months to run, I'd say. And then, but I wouldn't expect a strong rebound afterwards. Not like the 2017-19 thing. We then had a big rebound in prices. And obviously we had the big shoot up that we've had, prices are way higher now than they were back then. So we did have a massive rally. I just can't see it happening this time around, but who knows, we'll see. We'll it'd be interesting in 2 years' time if when we're doing this in about 24 interviews times, just seem to do this every month. To reflect.
Well, we'll track it as it goes, Leith, because, we do this roughly every month at the moment because of all the economic issues that are going on.
Yeah, it's worth doing.
And look, the fact of the matter is there are externalities. We might get a massive crisis which creates a very significant cut in interest rates. We might get huge government stimulus. I mean, the COVID Mark II, the reason property prices shot up in 21 and 22 was all those policy interventions.
Yep. And obviously created interest rates too, remember?
Absolutely right. Created inflation, of course, which is now what we're still battling with. So there are consequences. Leith, if people want to find out more about you and what you do, where do they go?
Okay, so if you want to read my stuff every day, go to macrobusiness.com.au. Want to see interviews and podcasts and that sort of stuff, go to my YouTube, which is put my name in, you'll see it, or at Leithvo. I'm doing Senate estimates tomorrow, or I'm actually doing the Senate Committee on Productivity, I think it is, tomorrow at about 3 p.m. So that should be interesting. I'll be talking about productivity, immigration, that sort of thing. So getting interviewed by senators, or grilled by senators, I should say. So that's a first for me. Never done that before, but I got asked to do it. So I guess that means I'm moving up in the world, I suppose.
Well, congratulations, Leith. I actually appeared for you a couple of those things some years ago relating to the housing market and things. It's quite an interesting experience. Yeah, it was great fun because actually we were able to have some quite frank conversation. And, I was able to push back on some of the assumptions that they actually made about things. So, go in with the boots blazing.
Yeah. So it'll be in this room because it's not obviously through WebEx. I'm not flying to Canberra for it. So, it'll be interesting. So I'm supposed to give an opening statement, which is interesting. I got to think about what I'm going to say, but
well, you can choose to do an opening statement. You don't have to. So.
Oh no, they want one. I'll do it for sure.
Yeah,
I'll do it. I already know what I'm going to say. I'm going to open up with some quotes from some not so generous quotes about the migration system from Labor ministers made in 2023. So that way it'll disarm the Labor people in the room because hang on, that was your minister who said that, and that was your, you said it was low productivity, low quality, blah blah blah, it was broken. Well, so you said that, not me. Anyway,
well, all the best. I'll get a debrief from you when we next speak, Leith. And thanks for all the work you're doing. This is a critical conversation we're having, and appreciate your coming on the channel as always. I'll take you offline, and
no problem. See you guys.
Thanks. See ya. There you go, folks. Hope you found that informative and interesting. Leith will be back in about a month's time. And just to say that next week, Damien Klassen will be on. We'll talk about the markets and the AI issues and the chip issues. Of course, Cosby was dropping today significantly, which is quite interesting. So a lot of fascinating things to think about there. I've got a bit of dog insofar that I've got half a dog in shot at the moment. Luna's sort of over there. Meteor, I don't know where she is. Oh, you can just see her paws. So she's around too. Anyway, thank you for spending time with us. Thank you very much to all those who provided super chats. Really appreciate all of those and all your comments and suggestions we went through. Please like, share, and repost this wherever you can. It really helps. And I look forward to seeing you on the next live show next Tuesday. And of course, we put out recorded shows each day of the week. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Take care. See you later.